Hello, Austin. We are having a podcast. I have relaunched my personal podcast that died in 2022, and now it's revitalized, just like a church revitalization, you might say.
Is this a
You and I,
revival?
survival, yeah. I just thought, I want to connect it a little bit to my Substack and riff on the ideas there and talk with friends and get to know someone like you who funnily enough, we've been talking for a while, but never actually met. And this is pseudo in
Yeah,
person, so it's been kind of a pleasure. We were
yeah, it
before the
has.
recording, talking about social media and all this kind of stuff. But you and I were chatting a little bit about John Mark Comer because I had published an article with TGC in the United States on his recent update to his book, God Has a Name. And I was kind of mentioning, I can't remember the conversation, but he was kind of being mentioned all over the place, and you were saying that he's become kind of, I don't know, somehow central in the discourse online. So do you want to kind of like
Yeah,
expand on that verbally?
yeah, sure. What I see when I see John Mark Cormer in the discourse right now, it actually triggers a lot of nostalgia in me, weirdly enough, because it reminds me of my own upbringing, coming into the young, restless, and reformed world, discovering Calvinism, discovering a covenantal reformed theology in the early teens, and the way people talked about Tim Keller and John Piper and all of those other guys in that cultural moment. I'm seeing the same thing kind of happen with Comer, and it's happening in spaces that I'm not in. I see it on X, we see it on Substack, in places where writers congregate, writers are writing about him. But I'm seeing him a lot on Instagram. He's got a pretty decent presence on TikTok topically, and it just feels eerily familiar. Not necessarily in a bad way. Like you talk about in your article, like there's some things that are coming with his rise that are good and commendable and encouraging, but there are some side effects to that as well.
Yeah, it's funny. To me, I may have heard of him in 2023 or earlier. I don't remember exactly, but it really wasn't at least till last year where it began to hit home. So I had I'm sort of like an interim. It's a whole complicated thing, but I'm kind of sent from a church to another church, and my home church is running it as a program. People in my own local congregation were reading his stuff. I heard about prairie churches in Canada beginning to use his spirituality program,
Yeah,
practicing the
practicing the
way.
way. Yeah.
And it was just kind of like everywhere. And then you kind of go on YouTube or online or his podcast. And the first time, even like so in our co-op groups or homeschooling cooperatives, people are talking about him. And
Oh yeah.
it's kind of just everywhere. I think you mentioned it felt a little bit like Tim Keller back in the early 2000s,
Yep.
where he's kind of like a really known entity that's crossing boundaries and circles.
Yes.
And as I
Yes.
told, I think one of the elders of the church I'm at, part of it is he's asking a question, and he's diagnosing a problem that virtually everyone feels and knows. Namely,
Yes.
there's this feeling that we are disconnected from Jesus, and there's almost like a liminal space between us two that you might characterize as like a formality in faith.
Yeah, I think so. I think what Comer has done that I appreciate is that he has taken treasures from theological traditions that otherwise would maybe kind of be obscured by those traditions. I'm thinking especially like the Book of Common Prayer. And he's taken those and he's recontextualized those in a way that makes the benefit of those disciplines immediately accessible without the baggage of the denominational weight. I'm not an Anglican, but I use the Book of Common Prayer almost every day. It's my go-to devotional resource. But I know how to separate the Anglicanism and all of the history and the tradition of Anglicanism as a denomination from the practice of the Book of Common Prayer. And for people who don't know how to do that, it could be really intimidating and overwhelming, giving them like an easier on-ramp to get into those kind of disciplines without having to wade into all of the confessional history and confessional territory,
Yeah.
which is the subject of the piece that you wrote today.
Yeah, well, that's one of the fascinating things. When I look at his footnotes or citations or references, it's all the people that I love. I mean, he
Yeah.
cites a Philkalea, which is this accumulation of spiritual writings that was, I think, published around the 1700s, full of the people that I love and read. But the authors in that book are part of a creedal and confessional is later, obviously, but a creedal trajectory that speaks about God in a way that John Mark Comer doesn't appear to like to when it comes to immutability, impassibility, simplicity, and so on. And it's interesting to me, some of the sort of mystical writings that he's citing require God to be infinite and simple for the sake of the mystical,
Yeah.
the mystical ascent. So, for example, Gregory of Nyssa, in his writing on the ascent of Moses, it's the closer you get to God, the darker the cloud becomes on Mount Sinai, because God is unknowable ultimately.
Yeah.
And so there's an interesting thing. He makes it accessible. He's citing these groups, but I don't detect sort of a deep engagement on their actual ecclesial context, which I think
Yes.
maybe makes his writing less useful than it could be.
Yeah, that's been the biggest thing that I've noticed, especially with students at my church and the college group. Comer's all the rage. Like everybody, they're all reading Comer and they all love it. And it is exposing them to people in the history of the church that they may not otherwise ever hear their name or ever encounter. And I appreciate that. But I wonder if it's introducing their ideas and their works in a way to where if they were to ever go and engage with them, if they were ever to go pick up a popular patristics volume of their works and try to read it, they're going to be very confused by what they find, because the way he kind of synthesizes all of their works is going to end up being very different from what they actually encounter.
Yeah, I think that's right. So one of the reasons we are just recording just to kind of have a riff on that review that I wrote. I'm not going to be as savvy as maybe you want me to be, but I'll just quickly share it on the screen here. Does that work the way I think it does? Yes, it does.
I think so. It does, yes.
And I can. This is a little known website called the Gospel Coalition. You may have heard of it. And if you scroll on down to the book reviews, I wrote this review here where I only note it so if you're a viewer, you can kind of click into and see all the things that I say there, but I'm not necessarily going to talk through the review in this. The reason I actually wrote that well, funnily enough, I wrote two things on him before. I wrote this kind of long personal mega thing, largely because my local church and the church that I was sort of sent from are both really into him, and I was just curious, like, what's he say? So I listened to a bunch of sermons, read a couple of his books, wrote copious notes down, and I started realizing, oh, this is weird. Like, he has these statements where he says, God changes his mind at a moment's notice based on, how you communicate with him. And I was like, that doesn't really fit with most of the authors that he's citing, whether they're Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, or Protestant.
Right.
And then I noticed some strange things, like in his Practicing the Way, if memory serves, at least twice he mentions that his spiritual director is a Jesuit priest.
Yes.
So, totally fine to have a spiritual life director. Mm-hmm. But it strikes me that if you're probably not vibing Protestant,
right,
if you're engaging in having a Jesuit priest. It's kind of one of those things, like, to be Protestant is not to have a Jesuit spiritual life director.
An easy baseline, I would say.
It's an easy baseline. It doesn't mean you can't be. I'm not trying to even criticize the idea of a spiritual life director. It's just okay. It's one of those things. So I began to kind of go through this process. Then you begin to read. His affirmations are sometimes so uncareful that he has to, even in his footnotes, say, by the way, I'm not an open theist. Just so you know, even though I say God doesn't really kind of control the future, and I'm not really worried about his omniscience and all that kind of stuff, but you need to know that I'm not that. And, I believe him. I think he's honest in that. I just think when you have to qualify so strongly that you're for sure not an open theist because you're saying things so close to that, then it kind of makes my eyebrows raise. So I'm not, someone like him, I'm not grumpy or mad or anything like that. I just feel like there are better resources out there. It's kind of funny. I probably shouldn't say this out loud because I don't know who's listening, but I've been a part of a process to start with a Protestant prayer order, which is the Order of St. Benedict. And,
really? You don't say.
The qualifications are simply daily prayer and weekly Eucharist, Lord's Supper. So it's not like an actual. It's for people who are married. It's not meant to be like this, but it's fully evangelical Protestant. Because I think there's something important to submit in your life to the simplicity of a superior's guidance.
Yes.
Problem is, for John Mark Comer, in my view of his book and Practicing the Way, is that he actually kind of creates this sort of paradigm that you sort of choose your own way of life.
Yes.
And it seems to defeat the purpose of submitting your life to a superior who guides you. So it was a bit weird to me. I'm not sure why he went in that direction.
Yeah. And I think you would say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, that like I have my concerns, but they're coming from a place of I want to see this guy be more helpful and more fruitful than he currently is. Like I do not want him to go away. I'm super thankful that he's found the audience that he's found and that they're lapping up what he is saying and putting it into practice. Praise the Lord. That is awesome. I want him to be more fruitful in that. But there does come a point where you can only synthesize from so many different sources from so long to where the thing that you create, the synthesis that you create, it becomes its own standalone thing. And if you ever move beyond that synthesized amalgamation of everything, you're going to have trouble making sense of each of the parts of that whole. You know, if you go and you study monasticism in the early church, it's going to look very different from the impression that you may get reading about it in the way Comer uses it. And I'm not saying that he's necessarily doing a bad job. I'm just saying we shouldn't use these things as a means to an end if in the process of doing that we create a false impression or an inaccurate impression about the sources we're pulling from.
Yeah, and one thing to sort of commend Comer, I would say, is, you know, I listened to him recently. He has a conservative, traditional view of sex that you may not expect. Yeah. Like, you might kind of hear him and think, oh, he's sort of trending towards whatever progressivism, but you're like, no, he has a pretty traditional view of like sexuality and morality. So he's not doing that. I think he's genuinely seen a problem where people are disconnected from Jesus, and as he says, he wants people to be transformed essentially by apprenticeship to Jesus. I think he gets that from a Californian spiritual guy, Dallas Willard.
Yes, he's a big
tradition.
Dallas Willard fan, yeah.
And you know what, like, there's something too that I've used to live in Southern California. I've been a part of circles there that were a little bit more formal. Mm-hmm. And something Dallas Willard does sort of give you, hey, you know, there's something there.
Yes.
And so I don't know. I think because I wrote a review, there's a sense in which you point out the problems. But I hope, you know, that he could actually read that review and feel like he could have a conversation with me and I wouldn't be grumpy with him.
Yeah.
But rather I'm just trying to help the constituency that are common readers understand who he is and where he's coming from so they can make prudential judgments. This is true, I think. I'll say kind of one practical thing that maybe you could finish, and then we'll stop in a couple of minutes here because we both have to run.
Yeah, our kids. My son is screaming in the other room.
Yeah. We'll have like a 2-minute warning. Is like you know, if there's a confessional church, you know, in Canada or in the U.S. that's running his programs, I think it's just worth asking: does he match what our church teaches? Yes. It's just a basic question. It doesn't mean he's bad or a bad guy or something if he doesn't. But it's probably important to ask that question because if he doesn't, maybe it communicates an odd thing. Now, he's written a book on the doctrine of God, so it is a subject he feels that he can publish on. So much so that he actually released an updated edition, I believe it was October of last year, something like that. So he's writing on the doctrine of God. So if his doctrine of God doesn't match your church's confession of faith, then I think you should probably ask the question, is he the best resource for us to be using?
Yeah, the thing about this whole discourse, and I'll just comment on like the discourse and from what I've seen from all the various places I see it play out, is that there's this tension between the theological and the pastoral and the practical, to where these two things are inadvertently being pitted against each other as though, you know, when push comes to shove, we need to get our people actually practicing following Jesus in meaningful, tangible ways and actually exercising meaningful spiritual disciplines, which means we need to focus on the practical side, and the theological side is maybe not as helpful right now. But that's just not true. The theological and the pastoral are never at odds with one another. There's wisdom in how you talk about it, and there's wisdom on what you maybe emphasize in a moment or a season. But the pastoral and the theological will always be in perfect harmony with each other. There are a few things more practical to following Jesus than just going through your day and just constantly meditating on the unchanging simplicity of God and seeing every moment in your life in that light. A few things will be more practical for your spirituality than doing that.
We just started, my friend Matthew Hoskin and I just released a podcast series on Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy. And it's a huge thing he harkens on, is that if you value things that can be lost, where moth can eat and rust can eat away at, as Jesus says, then when those things go away, when your fortunes change, so will your happiness change. But if your happiness is tied to something that can't change, and ultimately that's God, then you can be content in all situations, whether in heights or depths, in little or in much, as Paul also says. Thank you, Austin, for this podcast. It was a ton of fun. I know it was short,
was a pleasure.
Why not?
This was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on, Wyatt. I appreciate it.
For sure.